How should you build every ADC in Smite 2? How does each god's build differ depending on their abilities? Join me as we discover exactly what combination of items is best on every god and why, along with learning the intricate mechanics of every item a hunter might buy. Hunters have changed massively from Smite 1 to Smite 2, with the biggest change being in their item pool. They now have access to an array of new items, and as this channel name suggests, I've done the math and calculated that every god in the game can now have 60 million different combinations of damage items. Which begs the question, which combination is the best? With every god in the game now scaling with both strength and intelligence, hunters have an opportunity to explore multiple build paths. This flexibility not only opens up new strategies, but also allows players to customize their playstyle, especially on gods like Cernunnos and Sol. It is worth mentioning here that gods' auto attacks gain damage equal to 100% of a god's strength and 20% of their intelligence. Which means on average strength items do contribute more to a god's auto attack damage than intelligence items. But during the course of this video, we'll discover the fringe cases where intelligence items can significantly contribute to overall damage over strength items. I've built a computer model which has tested every single combination of items for every hunter in the game, so we can specifically see how a god's auto attack enhancing abilities could affect their overall build paths. As an example, Cernunnos gains penetration from his first ability based off his intelligence, so could it be worth buying one intelligence item to boost this effect? Will that increase his overall damage? He also gains 22% of his intelligence as damage on top of his auto attacks if his intelligence is higher than his strength. With these two things in combination, will Cernunnos deal higher auto attack damage with a pure intelligence build? Let's start off with Neith and Anhur, who both have only small buffs that they can gain for their auto attack damage. Neith can gain up to 6% attacks and Anhur can gain up to 20% auto attack damage, but only when enemies are standing in his first ability, Shifting Sands. Because of these small and inconsistent buffs, I have modelled Anhur and Neith as gods with no extra buffs to their damage. This allows us to have a baseline of what hunter builds should look like when the hunter has no added effects. Here are the results. As we can see, strength items do take priority over intelligence items for these gods, with Hunter's Cowl unsurprisingly being the favourite starter item when we only consider maximum damage. We can also see items like Demon Blade appearing in 4 of the top 5 builds, with its crit chance, which increases auto attack damage by 1.75 times on a critical hit, and attack speed being invaluable in these hunter builds. We also see Kinsblade in all of these top builds, and in fact I can tell you Kinsblade appears in 95 of the top 100 builds, showing it is almost a must-buy item. The first build where Kins does not appear is build number 29, which favours more crit damage and forgoes the Kins damage. We can also see instances of Braggy's Harp appearing in these builds, which provides an extra 45 magical damage on each of your basic attacks. In Smite 1, this only would have been viable on magical characters, because you had to build magical penetration to boost your magical damage, but in Smite 2, all penetration is penetration for both your physical and magical attacks. So building magical damage items is now viable on physical characters. This brings us onto the biggest feature of all of these builds, penetration. You probably noticed straight away that Obsidian Shard is appearing in all of these builds, which is not a strength item. It in fact has 60 intelligence on it, which translates to only 12 extra basic attack damage, but its defining feature is its penetration. It is only one of 2 items in the game that provides a constant 25% penetration, the other item being Typhons Fang, which also appears in every single one of these builds. In Smite 2, penetration has no cap, meaning you can stack penetration up to 100%. If you've seen my protections and penetration video for Smite 1, you know why this is extremely potent, as damage increases exponentially with penetration. This is why we can see Obsidian Shard, Titan's Bane and Executioner in all of these builds. The penetration is invaluable against these targets, and these tankier targets take the longest to kill. And even though Obsidian Shard isn't contributing much to your basic attack damage, the fact that it takes up only one item slot and has 25% penetration makes it more than worthwhile. So, how exactly have I determined these are the best builds? These builds have been ordered on how long it takes to kill the entire enemy team. So this first build will kill the entire enemy team in 16.55 seconds, as long as they have a standard enemy team comp of 3 damage dealers and 2 tanks. I have also taken into account spectral armor, which decreases my simulated hunter's attack speed and crit chance, but only some of the time. This is my attempt to learn what items are best and how good some items are versus other items. But this simulation can never be perfect. It cannot simulate every possibility in the game, but more on that later. Let's quickly go over why these builds are valuing percent penetration highly. Because this model simulates how long it takes to kill the whole enemy team, it super highly values builds that kill tanks fast, because tanks have the highest health and so take the longest to kill of any of the enemy types. Any build that does less damage to tanks skyrockets the total time to kill the whole enemy team, because the hunter will take so much longer to kill the tank. This is why the builds stack so much percent penetration. To demonstrate this, let's look at this graph. Let's take an example where a hunter has a build that kills squishies in 10 seconds, a solo laner in 25 seconds, and a tank in 35 seconds. Now let's say the hunter changes their build to one that will kill squishies twice as fast. So now it only takes 5 seconds to kill the squishies. But in optimizing to kill squishy targets, it has greatly increased the time to kill the tanks. So while the hunter saved 15 seconds killing the squishies, they lost 25 seconds to kill the tanks. This is why my model spits out builds with high penetration, because it takes so much longer to kill the tanks. Here is a graph of how many hits it would take for a hunter to kill a tank, where we vary the hunter's penetration. As you can see, at 0% penetration, it takes 80 auto attacks to fully deplete the enemy's health bar. As the hunter gains penetration, you can see the amount of hits it takes to kill the enemy tank decreases, until at 100% it takes just 20 auto attacks to kill that enemy. As something to compare this graph to, here's how many hits it would take to kill a tank when the hunter goes from 0 to 100% crit chance, with no penetration. As you can see, at 100% crit chance, it is 2 times less efficient than 100% penetration. This is why penetration is so greatly valued in these builds. It is by far the most damage efficient stat for killing tanks. But in a real game scenario, this may not be the most viable option. Maybe killing the tank slower and killing the damage dealers as quickly as possible will be more viable, which is why I am also showing you builds with less penetration. It's up to you to decide what kind of build is optimal for your game. I'm now showing you the top 15 builds for standard hunters. We can see Obsidian Shard is not a must-buy item from these 3 builds here. So if you don't want to build almost purely as a tank destroyer, here are some more options for you. Of course, there's also the matter of lifesteal, which is essential in nearly all hunter builds to give you enough sustain to stay in lane. So here are the top 10 builds that contain lifesteal. Again, we can see stacking insane amounts of penetration being extremely favourable, with Serrated Edge being a penetration and lifesteal option. If you want more lifesteal than these builds provide, try swapping out the lifesteal items for the Reaper or Typhons Fang. I also want to mention here that gods like Neith have high intelligence scaling on their abilities, so you probably want to build her with a high intelligence build and not optimize for her auto attacks. But this video will only consider gods damage with their auto attacks and not their abilities. I'll be doing an abilities video shortly. Now we can move on how to build specific gods, and let's start with Sol, typically thought of as a magical ADC, but now of course she can be built with either strength or intelligence. For Sol, I modelled her at max heat. This is because it's not too difficult to keep her heat up, especially during a fight. For those that don't know, Sol gains heat through using abilities and hitting auto attacks. At max heat, she gains 25 strength, 25 intelligence, 30% attack speed, and 15% basic attack damage. At face value, you'd think her builds would heavily favour crit, as she can afford to build crit items without fearing their lack of attack speed, as well as the fact that crit scales greatly with her 15% extra basic attack damage at max heat. But just to be sure, I've tested 60 million builds to see what suits her best. As you can see, the builds stay very similar to the top builds for a standard hunter, but her time to kill has dropped substantially because she is at max heat. Titan's Bane, Executioner and Obsidian Shard are still core items on her, and in fact her builds stay very similar to the builds for a standard hunter. But things get more interesting as we look a little bit deeper into her top 20 builds. Her 6th top build doesn't contain Obsidian Shard, instead opting for a much more crit orientated option. Her extra basic attack damage means that she smashes through squishy characters so efficiently with crit that it makes killing the tanks quicker slightly less valuable. If you want a build to kill the enemy damage dealers quicker while still doing good damage to tanks, this is the build for you. If we move on to the 17th top build, we can finally see a high intelligence item appear. Book of Thoth. Both Transcendence and Book of Thoth give you extra damage based off of your mana, and they both give insane amounts of mana, making them a lethal combination. In fact, just on their own, these two items provide you with 130 basic attack damage, which is higher than any other combination of items in the game, along with providing you with a nice bit of intelligence to boost your ability damage. These two items also both provide 10 flat pen, which greatly increases your damage against squishy targets. Of course, you may also want lifesteal in your builds, so here are the top 10 builds for Sol that contain lifesteal. If you want to build with more than 30% lifesteal, which may be viable, here are the top builds. We can see building 2 lifesteal items still yields a high damage build, and in fact you will do more damage overall building both Serrated Edge and Devour's Gauntlet compared to just building 1 high lifesteal item like Typhons Fang or the Reaper, although when fully stacked it is likely that the Reaper would be the best for overall damage, but I have modelled it to just have 1 stack in my simulation. Now we can move on to Jing Wei, who has 3 abilities that increase her overall auto attack damage. Firstly, her first ability, which provides a 40% attack speed buff at level 20. She can get this buff by moving into this area. Once she leaves the area, the buff will persist for 6 seconds, but the area lasts for 6 seconds, so if she can stay in this area for 6 seconds during a fight, the buff will last a total of 12 seconds, which is also the cooldown of this ability, which means this attack speed buff has a potential uptime of 100%. Her second ability increases her crit chance by 15% and her auto attack damage by 15% for 3 auto attacks, while also giving the attacks splash damage, which can be great for when enemies are grouped up. She gains 3 charges of this ability, which means in total, if you go into a fight with 3 charges, you can fire 9 of these enhanced auto attacks in succession. Her third ability also gives her a strength bonus, which is greater when she dashes from a knock-up. This can make her very dangerous to fight when she has all 3 of her abilities activated, gaining increased attack speed, strength, crit chance, and auto attack damage. To simulate Jing Wei, I allowed her to have her attack speed buff active 50% of the time, which might seem a little low considering that she can have 100% uptime on this buff. But in a real game, it is much more likely you'll proc the buff and move or dash out of the buff area, and even then you may lose out on some of the time of the buff when chasing enemies. After working out how often her 2 is active, I have allowed Jing Wei to have 1/2 of her attacks being enhanced splash damage auto attacks, and I have not given her any strength from her 3, as using your escape for damage can be risky. So after simulating Jing Wei, let's have a look at her best builds. Her builds are similar to a standard hunter when we just consider her top 5 builds, but there are a few caveats to how you should build her overall. Firstly is that because of her increased crit chance, she benefits much more greatly from Deathbringer than any other god, as Deathbringer becomes more efficient with higher crit chance. This is why, when we look at her top 20 builds, we can see a much greater frequency of Deathbringer appearing when compared to a standard hunter. I also want to point out that I modelled her 2 being active for half of her auto attacks, which is definitely on the upper end of how many auto attacks will be enhanced in a fight in a real game. But if you're careful with the cooldown of this ability, you can definitely kill a squishy target only using enhanced auto attacks. I would recommend this 5th build here, which still has great damage and much higher crit chance, which will meld with Jing Wei's kit much better than the top build. It also depends on how well you use her kit. If you save your 2 for the optimal moments, this 6th build will smash through damage dealers super fast, although it will still be slightly lacking against tanks, especially when they have spectral armor. Now here are the top 10 builds with lifesteal. We can see crit falls off quite hard and barely appears in the top 5 builds, but when we again consider that maybe these builds are overvaluing killing tanks, this 6th build seems the most appealing. I just want to make a note here that Deathbringer in a build with no other crit items is quite risky. Deathbringer increases your crit damage by 25%, and so scales greatly with other crit items, because the more crit chance you have, the value you get from Deathbringer increases. But there is a caveat to this, and that is that spectral armor decreases your crit chance by 20%. So if you have only Deathbringer in your build next to an enemy with a spectral armor, it reduces your crit chance to 0, and so you no longer get the extra 25% bonus to your crit damage because you cannot crit the enemy. So if you have only Deathbringer in your build and the enemy has Spectral, Deathbringer becomes a 0 crit chance item with no passive, which is super inefficient. The same is true for only having Demon Blade in your build, as that procs off of crits. So again, this item essentially has no crit chance and no passive when you're next to an enemy with Spectral Armor. This means these two items should almost always be paired with other crit items. Deathbringer because it scales well off of other crit items, and Demon Blade because it procs off of crits. And both of these item passives become redundant if you are next to an enemy with Spectral Armor. And now we can move on to our final and most interesting god, Cernunnos. As we've already mentioned, he scales well with both intelligence and strength, so just how will his top build shake out? Cernunnos' 1, Shifting Seasons, has 4 different effects. In Summer Stance, it will provide extra damage, giving you plus 22% of your strength or intelligence as extra damage to each of your auto attacks. His Autumn Stance provides 25 penetration and an additional 5% of your intelligence as flat penetration. Again, if you've seen my protections and penetration video, you'll know just how much this could increase your damage against squishy targets. His Spring Stance provides you with healing every time you basic attack, giving you 10 health plus 15% of your intelligence as healing at max rank, giving you free sustain and meaning you may not feel the need to build a lifesteal item if you have enough intelligence. His Winter Stance provides you with a 14% slow plus 2.5% of your intelligence on every auto attack, which is a super strong effect for any hunter. Anything that allows you to hit more auto attacks on a hunter is insanely strong. I have modelled Cernunnos to always have the penetration from his auto stance activated, as well as the fact that he always has his Summer Stance extra damage activated too. Doing well with this god definitely relies on using your stances as efficiently as possible, and I have modelled this god to reflect someone using him to his full potential. With all that said, here are his top 5 builds. We can see nothing too special is going on if you want to build Cernunnos purely for maximising auto attack damage. His builds still require high strength and high attack speed items. Here are his top 15 builds. We can see in build 14, we have a build with a still great time to kill of 14.39 seconds, and it contains a good amount of intelligence. This allows Cernunnos to get the benefits of abilities that scale with intelligence, meaning he can make good use of his healing stance, penetration stance, and slow stance, all while dealing great amounts of damage. Although this build does require double stacking, which may not be viable and the build will take a long time to come online, meaning you could fall behind in the early. So Cernunnos' top damage builds don't require high intelligence in order to do the maximum amount of damage, but with the amount of utility Cernunnos' first ability provides him when he does build high intelligence, could it be worth buying a hybrid build to take advantage of his intelligence scaling? Here are Cernunnos' top hybrid builds. We can see the time to kill has decreased by about 2.5 seconds, which isn't terrible, considering that now you can heal 60 health on every auto attack with your Spring Stance, slow enemies by 22% with your Winter Stance, and gain 41 flat penetration in your Autumn Stance, and increase your ability damage substantially. This utility may be invaluable in a game, and may give you an advantage over only going for a purely damage based build. But remember, this is if you're using Cernunnos optimally, always using whichever stance is best for the situation. Now, here are Cernunnos' top builds with lifesteal. We can see Devar's Gauntlets are a clear favourite on him, and his top damage builds with lifesteal do more damage than his high int builds. So it is more favourable to go for a high strength build with lifesteal for sustain, rather than trying to build a high int build using your Spring Stance for sustain. I want to make an important note here, and that's that I'm not recommending or endorsing the idea of putting Obsidian Shard in your builds. While yes, the builds with Ob Shard will kill the whole enemy team in the fastest time, for reasons I described earlier, but most hunters cannot take advantage of the intelligence of the item, and the item is quite weak for killing squishy targets. And while yes, if you want to demolish tanks, then you can definitely build Obsidian Shard, but if you want a more well-rounded build, swap out Obsidian Shard for another item. With this in mind, I'm now displaying every build for all of the hunters we've spoken about that doesn't contain Obsidian Shard. This will give you more options, so you can decide if you want a more well-rounded build, or if you're happy going for a tank destroying build. We can see not building Obsidian Shard only adds about 0.5 seconds to the time to kill the whole enemy team. A small sacrifice to make for being able to destroy squishies quickly. I'm now showing you the top builds for each god without Obsidian Shard and with Lifesteal, just to give you more options. An interesting note here is that in the simulation to generate these hunter builds, I gave the enemy solo laner and the enemy support spectral armor, whereas in the simulations I've shown you before this, I only gave the enemy support spec. The most interesting finding about simulating the model like this is that the order of the builds barely changed, whether both tanks had spectral or not. This shows that spectral armor is barely a deterrent to a hunter building crit chance. Spectral armor will need a big buff, and just like in Smite 1, it will likely have to decrease crit damage if the devs want to discourage hunters from building crit. At the minute, crit is definitely the way to build a hunter. There's also the matter of active items for hunters. There are 5 active items a hunter might want to buy. Bloodforge, which offers you a shield of 10% of your maximum HP and 100% of your strength. Dagger of Frenzy, which gives you 40 basic attack damage and 30% attack speed for 6 seconds. Avatar's Parachute, which gives you 20% strength for 6 seconds. Death Metal, which gives you strength, int, and attack speed to your allies for 6 seconds. And finally, Pendulum Blade, which offers a reduction to all of your cooldowns by 3 seconds. Buying these active items will decrease your average damage, but the key thing about them is that they will give you a massive advantage if you use them at the correct time, making them more than viable options for hunters. With this in mind, here are the top 5 builds for every hunter with at least one active item. These builds must also contain Lifesteal, and I've disabled Obsidian Shard in this simulation. But bear in mind, these items can be very powerful, but only when used at the perfect moment. So if you do buy these items, you want to use them as much as possible, but always at the right time. I just want to quickly talk about a couple of items that have not appeared in these top builds, but I still think are very strong items. I have fully modelled Death's Embrace, but it doesn't appear in any of the top builds because it is more a sustain item than a damage item. But if you would like to see the top builds for a standard hunter that contains Death's Embrace as a starter item, here they are. And the Reaper also hasn't appeared in these builds, but it is a strong item with a strong lifesteal and strength gain effect. Here are the top 10 builds for a standard hunter that contain the Reaper. And finally, Typhons Fang is a lifesteal item that has no damaging stats, but does boast 40% lifesteal on a single item. So here are the top 10 builds that contain Typhons Fang. And that's everything. I hope you would learn something and are excited as me to try out these new builds, especially on Cernunnos, whose kit I personally think is so interesting and makes me excited for what Hi-Rez will do in the future with int and strength scaling, especially on hunters. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't guess, do the math.